I thank you very much for joining the keynote session of our conference here. I will continue to chat a little bit until the point where I see those who really want to join did so, and take your time with finishing the cake, but maybe at some point take a seat and we can start that session so that we can also start on time with the reception. It's basically us here between you and the reception. So, good afternoon. Hello, my name is Kai Wickrich. I'm a professor of public administration and public policy at the Hertie School, and it's my big pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 edition of the ECPR Standing Group on Regulatory Governance conference, and it is a particular pleasure to open this keynote session, which again will be followed by a reception, which is right outside this door. Let me begin by welcoming you to Berlin and our home here, the Hertie School. For those of you who haven't been to Berlin, or it has been a while, we are just a few steps from the Gendarmenmarkt, which is quite an iconic and I think beautiful square to look at. When you need some time off from the conference, the Tiergarten is maybe 1.5 kilometers away and is a real green space. That we don't have green space in that road is a topic for discussion about urban policy that is maybe for during the reception. It is a particular pleasure to welcome you and the colleagues from the ECPR Standing Group, whose members really have helped and did shape and advance the field exactly for 2 decades now. This is the 10th edition of this biannual conference. And special recognition and thanks go to David Levy-Faurer, who I've seen in the room. There you are, who, if I remember correctly, created the group together with Jacint Jordana 20 years ago, and this was on the basis of the edited volume, was it called Regulatory Capitalism, which kind of paved the way for what all of us are doing for some time now. So thank you for your intellectual leadership, for your institutional scaffolding of basically us. And the Standing Group is really remarkable and is remarkably successful in building this field. Since the early days, it has provided the frame for us to think systematically about rulemaking, oversight, delegation, and accountability across countries, sectors, and institutional forms. It has also helped to give shape to a truly interdisciplinary field, and that's remarkable. A truly interdisciplinary field, where I would say political science is still somewhat like the anchor, but adjacent fields to the economists play an important role, including economics, but also in particular law, sociology, and other fields. And all this kind of interdisciplinary nature of what we are doing here has really shaped our thinking about regulation and governance. One of the key achievements of that field, I think, was to develop, clarify, and proliferate the concept of the regulatory state, a model of governance that relies on standards, procedures, and independent regulatory agencies, rather than direct state ownership or hierarchical control. It is a form of governing that regulates competing interests to promote efficiency, balance, and accountability. And it seeks legitimacy through expertise, insulation from politics, and rule-based decision-making. But success also demands reflection, especially when the context in which our ideas were developed has quite fundamentally, as I would say, shifted. This is why this year's theme we suggested is beyond the regulatory state, still with the question mark which the leaders of the group insisted to put in there. We ask, are we witnessing the limits of this model of the regulatory state? Do the tools and assumptions we've worked with still match the political and institutional realities we now face? You know the catchwords, the digital technologies that radically changed how public market and social interactions involve, the poly-crises, climate, energy, health, that demand speed and bold political decision-making and coordination, geopolitical shocks and persistent tensions that disrupt consensus around neutrality and rulemaking, and the rise of authoritarian populism that increasingly questions our ideas about what good policymaking and what good governance entails. This is a moment to revisit our assumptions, rethink our models, and reimagine what governance can and should be. It is also fitting that we are discussing these questions here at the Hertie School, which is itself just over 20 years old. The school was founded at a time of, I would say, governance optimism, a moment when institutional innovation, regulatory capacity, and evidence-based policy making were seen as the key to improving public problem solving. Today, we are searching for a new balance, one that preserves the value of evidence-based decision-making, while taking seriously the challenges to legitimacy and the need for sometimes strong political intervention. To begin our discussion, we will hear two keynote addresses, one after the other, obviously. After the second talk, I will moderate a short discussion between our speakers and then open the floor to questions. Our first speaker, and I'm quite proud that we managed to get her, is Arancha González Elaya, Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. Mrs. González served as Spain's Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation. Previously, she was Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director at the International Trade Center. Her distinguished career spans global diplomacy, trade, and institutional reform, offering a compelling perspectives on today's governance challenges. Welcome, Arancha, and thanks again for being with us today. Our second speaker is Michael Zürn, Director of the Global Governance Unit at the WZB, the Berlin Social Science Center, and Professor at the Freie Universität. He is a leading scholar in global governance, democratic legitimacy, and the contestation of international institutions. He, until very recently, served as co-director of the DFG's Scripts Cluster of Excellence, which discussed and explored issues of the contestation of the liberal script. And significantly for this event, and for me personally, he was the founding dean, that's the position which is now called president of the Hertie School, and the person who also hired me. So thank you for that, and thanks for agreeing to join us. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Arancha González Elaya. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you to this group for the invitation. I'm a bit humbled because I'm not a scholar of governance, and now I know that I am in this category of not being an economist or a political scientist. I'm in this category of other, in the lawyer's category, right? But what I thought I would do is speak from the experience of a practitioner, because this I have done. Practice the art of governance, finding agreements, building regulations, treaties, international agreements, national constructs at the national, at the European, at the international level. To tell you the truth, I'm quite happy right now because I spent quite a lot of time negotiating after the Brexit, the leftovers of Brexit in the form of a deal on Gibraltar between the UK and Spain. And it just now finally 4 years later, this has been transformed into an EU-UK deal on Gibraltar. So I'm pretty happy in talking about this subject because it is possible to do these things. So my starting point would be to look at the challenges to governance today, to doing regulatory governance, but leave you with a sense of what I think, how we should tackle this with a certain sense of can-do. I wouldn't call it optimism because it's a big word, but a can-do message. Regulatory governance today is difficult because essentially regulatory governance is about checks and balances. And checks and balances today are not in a good health. And this is the essence of the difficulty we are facing. If you look around the world, the checks and balances that are an integral part of our way of understanding democracy are under pressure. They are under pressure from different viewpoints. So let me unpack what I see as some of these pressure points. The first pressure point has to do with the issues at the heart of our regulatory drive. They are becoming much more complex to deal with. They are fast changing. They are much more interrelated, and they have faster side effects that we may not be able to detect at the beginning when we try to regulate them. And this is a difficult proposition because as a regulator, as a setter of the standards, as the one that would negotiate the limitations, the distribution, you need to understand. And sometimes you are facing an enormously complex subject matter that you need to regulate on, very often not really fully possessing the knowledge on which you're going to regulate. Thus knowledge very often being in those that generate technology, generate neurosciences. And you needed to rely on those that generate it to understand, with the possibility or the potential for state capture, for capture, business capture, interest capture. So I guess the first difficulty we have to recognize is the enormous complexity of the issues that we have to regulate today. If I look at artificial intelligence, or if I look at cryptocurrencies, two very distinct issues. They have in common that they are pushed by technology. They are the product of technology. It's becoming difficult to do it. It's also difficult because of the complexity of the different dimensions involved when we try to regulate. I think it's fair to say that this is what we have figured out in regulating climate change. The tagline is pretty easy. We got to reduce CO2 emissions. But then comes, all the implications beyond or below reducing CO2 emissions. We've got to face the transport systems. We've got to confront food systems. We've got to tackle production and consumption. We've got to discuss and incorporate in our regulatory approaches financial systems. We've got to think of buildings. It's very complex. And I want to, in doing it, we've got to do this in a manner that kind of introduces coherence or applies coherence. Because we know that if we are not coherent, we build cracks. And the cracks in the design are carried forward thereafter. If we don't design the emission trading system in the right way, then we have a very imperfect system that we've got to compensate with a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And if we don't do the carbon border adjustment mechanism properly, then. So we've got also to grapple with the interrelated nature of some of these issues that we want to regulate. Take even one of the dimensions of this CO2 emissions drive, which is energy systems. It's not just about renewable energy and incorporating more renewable energy in our energy mix, changing the energy mix. It's also, as we are discovering, investing in the infrastructure. It's also investing in the charging and storage of energy in order to be able to better regulate the grid. It's also about interconnections. So if we do some, but we don't do the other, then our system of regulation is not going to produce the desired results. We are going to be confronted with failures in the system, and we are seeing those failures today. It's fair to say that if I look at climate change, today in Europe, we took a very clear sustainability approach, and now we are having to balance the sustainability approach we took with two other dimensions that we maybe did not incorporate in the design of the Green Deal at the beginning, but are becoming more pressing: competitiveness and security. Because we forgot that security is also the name of the game today. So if I take the electric vehicles today, we did a lot on the sustainability part, but we forgot the competitiveness and the security. And now we are having to adjust this, and we are adjusting this as we go along. Now, maybe we thought there was another way of doing it and we couldn't do that, maybe, but I think we should take lessons in terms of how do we manage the complexity of the issues that we are trying to regulate and the interrelated nature of some of these issues. The second challenge to regulatory governance today has to do with the darkening of the geopolitical context. We were in a relatively benign global environment, and we are moving into a very rivalry-driven international environment. If I look back at the World Trade Organization, and if I look back at 1995, something incredible happened. It was the building of a new dispute settlement mechanism to govern international trade. It was the most perfect of the international dispute settlement mechanisms anywhere in the world. It was the result of a big clash between Europe and the US. Europe wanted a mechanism to discipline trade disputes that would look like the European Court of Justice. The US wanted a mechanism to adjudicate trade disputes that would be more like a super arbitration mechanism. And both sides fought it out, and a very innovative dispute settlement mechanism with binding effects on its members was agreed. Now, there was a big fight, but there was an understanding that all sides were looking for a deal. Right now, if I look at the international scene, I think it's fair to say that we are suffering from a huge doses of zero-sum mentality. And zero-sum in regulatory governance is a very poisonous ingredient. Now it's virtually impossible to imagine that we could build a dispute settlement mechanism like we did back in 1995, which is why Europe and a bunch of other countries, faced with the reality that the US has left the system, have decided to replicate the existing system and apply it between themselves. hoping that at a later point, maybe the US comes back to this agreement. I'm not sure they will. But it's a description of the difficulties we have internationally to reach agreements. Zero-sum mentality is basically that for one to gain, the other one has to lose. Or rather that the other one must lose, which is what we are seeing also today. And this is, therefore, it contradicts the principle, basically, that you accept certain limitations. Regulation is accepting to be limited, to limit your own behavior. And right now, internationally, at the time when countries feel they've got to fight it out, they feel that accepting unilateral constraints on their behavior is against their national interest. So what we're seeing is a proliferation of unilateral behavior, and therefore a complex environment for those who believe in the necessity to establish some rules of the game, or using the zero-sum game mentality to protect certain groups at the expense of other groups. My steelmakers against your steelmakers or his steelmakers. Think of another international space that is under stress today. Think of the international seabed. The seabed is a global common. There is an international agreement to limit exploration and exploitation of the seabed because it's meant to be for the common good of humanity. And yet, one country decides to issue an executive order that says, it's beyond my jurisdiction, it's beyond my national water, it's beyond my right, but I'm still going to exploit it. I'm going to map it, and I'm going to exploit it because it's in my interest. So this is the reality we are confronted today. Or think of zero-sum mentality in redistribution policies. What we are seeing, I would put this in the form of an anecdote, but these anecdotes in reality express a behavior. I was recently in San Diego, in the US, and I took a cab, and the cab driver was a Mexican. Me being Spanish, we started chatting. So I asked him, how do you feel about Donald Trump? How do you feel about your new president? And the answer was, for a small business, he was an Uber driver, for a small business like me, he is great. Is deregulation, and he's going to tackle migration. I said, oh, how so? He's going to get rid of all these Mexicans. So I didn't know what to say. So I said, well, why are there so Mexicans coming? They come for no purpose. I said, well, maybe they come because they want to find a job. No, ma'am. They come for no purpose. And it's good that the president kicks them out. I'm describing a zero-sum mentality. This is a migrant, first generation. He is in the US. He's doing good. He doesn't want competition. He wants his competitors out of the market. It's an anecdote, but it's an expression of the difficulties we face today also in this governance, in those regulatory spaces. Geopolitics is making it difficult also because with geopolitics come security. Security is inevitable. We are seeing the arrival of security concerns and the need to incorporate security in our regulatory drive. But what we are seeing also is the over-securitization of our regulatory frameworks, and even the abuse of security for purposes that have to do more with the traditional protectionist pulsions. Take the abuse recent abuse to impose tariffs, so-called reciprocal tariffs, in the so-called Liberation Day, using a very obscure piece of legislation called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's using national security to renounce to efficiency. There was always, also in the rules of international trade, the possibility to exclude trade opening and market access for reasons that have to do with security. But it was security with capital S. When capital S becomes little s, when everything is security, then what we are effectively doing is putting security well above efficiency. The third challenge that I see is also, and Kai mentioned it, is a more complex domestic landscapes. So it's not only that the international landscape is darkening, it's also that the domestic landscape is becoming more complex. We are seeing the eruption of populism. Populism didn't appear out of nowhere. It also has causes, and it also has responses. And what we are seeing is these forces at play to challenge established structures, this old idea that it's all about elites, to challenge scientific knowledge or scientific consensus. That very often is what you can use to anchor a regulatory drive. That silences dissent. It's very difficult when we silence dissent because there is no good outcome if we can't fight it out, if we cannot look at the positives and the negatives, at the costs and the benefits. When we see regulation is felt as intruding into individual lives. We've seen or challenging individual personal choices. We've seen this in many constituencies, for example, on consumption of red meat and the kind of reaction this has triggered on the population. Not to mention disinformation that also, in a way, muddles the kind of trust that is required in order to accept being limited by regulation. So in these circumstances, I think there is a big premium to accountability, to transparency, to participatory processes, to pedagogy, something that very often we forget to do. We are at the moment in Europe embarked into a big effort to build a European security and defense policy, which is tough. And we have to realize that it is tough and it will not be accepted by the citizens if we don't put good doses of pedagogy, of debate, of discussion, of building through debating and exposing the fors and exposing the against. The fourth one, sometimes we forget, but the organizational structures that we have facilitate or render it more complicated to do regulation. As the President of the European Commission was putting together her team last year, I thought I would raise a bit of an issue with organization, because I do think, at least is my experience in government, that the organizational structures of our governments, our governance organizational structures, are not fit for purpose. They are all in the vertical. And we are not good at horizontalizing the verticals. And that is this is a huge problem. So how we organize ourselves, how we build our governance structures can help us produce more coherent results or not. A couple of years ago, I was asked by the European Economics Commissioner, Gentiloni, to chair a wise persons group on the future of the customs union. Customs is the back office of our internal market. No one looks at the back office. We consider that the back office will produce results because it has to produce results. The front office makes good trade agreements. The front office does regulatory frameworks. The front office regulates on the safety of toys, on the security of products, on the CO2 content of products, on whether or not a product has been produced using slave labor or not. And the back office just has to follow. Well, the reality is the back office doesn't follow. The back office finds that for the same product, textiles, there are 5 different accountability mechanisms, 5 different websites that have to be filled with 5 different sets of KPIs, with 5 different sets of reporting obligations. How we organize ourselves can set ourselves for failure or not, which is why we have to pay a lot of attention to organizational structures. So enough on the challenges. I want to give you with a good piece of news. My sense or my lesson, the lesson that I take from my experience in governance and in government is that regulatory governance is politics. It's maybe politics with a small little p, but it's politics. Now, they can be done in a very independent manner. They can be done by experts. They can be done very surgically, but it is politics. So, to do good regulatory governance, we have to accept to play politics. If we play politics, maybe we can be a little bit more successful than if we pretend that we can do it by hiding ourselves from the political ground. This is enough from me. Thank you, and obviously looking forward to the conversation that will follow.
Thank you, Arancha, for this wonderful talk. In these days, it's rare that you hear optimistic, can-do talks of this quality, and so therefore I'm quite thankful for it. And I fear that I have to say that I come out a little bit less optimistic than you did in my talk. Thank you also for this very nice introduction, Kai. And as Kai mentioned, last year in 2024, the Hertie School marked its 20th century, right? And a milestone, not just for this institution, but for a broader intellectual journey in a sense. And here we are entering already the field of regulatory governance. And so it's fitting that today the Standing Group on Regulatory Governance gathers here in Berlin at the Hertie School. Both the Hertie School and this scholarly community, which is represented here, are deeply rooted in a sort of a shared paradigm. I don't know whether the Hertie School really have ever signed to regulatory governance, but I mean there is a sort of a common understanding of how to do good governance, a way of thinking about politics and policy making that has taken shape essentially in the context of globalized societies and knowledge-driven societies. That is in the background of this sort of intellectual journey that started probably, I don't know, 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And that makes this the perfect moment and in some sense also a good place to pause and to reflect. What has this paradigm achieved? What outcomes has it produced? And just as importantly, where has it fallen short? And I have to admit, those kind of questions were very much encouraged by Kai for my talk. So I think these are great questions, and I tried to take it up. And to cut a long story short, what I want to argue is essentially, yes, it was a remarkably successful research program. The citation counts of foundational works and the sheer scale of this community, look around here, gathered, speaks volumes in a sense, and the intellectual energy, the network, the policy impact, all this is deeply impressive. But success, as we know, does not preclude decline. Today, this paradigm and this thinking and the world that follows the logic of regulatory governance is clearly under pressure. On the one hand, on the one side, we see the rise of statist models of developments, those that champion strong hierarchical states as more capable governors. Countries like China, Singapore, Vietnam are, of course, the best examples of that. And on the other hand, within liberal democracies, the very heartland of regulatory governance, we are witnessing internal fractures. The rise of authoritarian populist parties and their growing success in taking over power in some countries at least poses an enormously serious threat. They are reshaping the political landscape from within. And here's the central claim that I want to make now in this talk. And I mean, I know I have only 30 minutes and it will be very rough, but here's the central claim I want to put forward. What we are seeing today, the forces eroding the logic of the regulatory state aren't some historical fluke. They are not simply external shocks that happen to disrupt a well-functioning system. No, the seeds of decline were in some ways planted by the very structures of regulatory governance itself. They are, at least in part, endogenous to regulatory governance. So I mean, the sort of challenges that we currently see of regulatory governance that's the basic thesis, to some extent, the outcome of regulatory governance. So I mean, that's a sort of a provocative thesis, and I want to put it forward, and let's discuss about it. Let me start out by saying few things are in our business so enjoyable as revisiting the foundational texts. I mean, that's always a lot of fun, I can tell you. And the ones that shaped this research program are also wonderful readings, and especially wonderful re-readings. I mean, they shaped how we think and teach and research. And so I must admit I had a really good time going back to some of the early writings of Domenico Maione, of Michael Moran, and of course also of Jacinth and David, who is sitting here. I think Jacinth is coming tomorrow, if I'm correctly informed. Maione, or one thing that struck me when I read this work, now again, after many, many years, what I really found funny, in a sense, is the sort of ambiguity between description and normativity. I mean, it was very hard to get, is this really something that they think we should do in the future, or is it a description of actually what is going on? And I clearly would say the most ambiguous in terms of this question, is it a descriptive program or a normative program, is Maione. I mean, there it was sort of sorry to the EUI freaks here, but Maione was extreme in that respect. I mean, he summarizes all this, all the compelling set of reasons for the EU's turn toward regulation and toward regulatory governance in this famous West European politics articles, and I just cite, fitting together all the variables, all the changes that he was talking about, budget constraints, bureaucratic and economic interests, the poor credibility of purely intergovernmental arrangements, last but not least, the highly technical nature of most regulatory policy making anyway, we begin to understand not only the origin and growth of community regulation, but also its increasingly innovative character. So, I mean, it's taking place, but it's also good, right? And the undertone regulatory governance is coming because there is no better alternative. That, I mean, going back in history, going back also in the history of the Hertie School, that reminded me, perhaps a little bit irreverently, of another famous line of this time and in this same historical context. This one not from academia, this one from Berlin Politics. I'm talking about Klaus Wowereit. In 2001, then the SPD leading candidate for governing mayor of Berlin stood before his party and said a sentence that quickly really became iconic in German politics. He said, "Ich bin schwul und das ist gut so. I'm gay and this is good so." And I mean, here we see the same sort of undertone. That's the way it is. There's no need for justification. And while this was a perfect line, a brilliant line, and he became mayor, and there is no need to justify if someone is gay, there is probably some need to justify when you say regulatory governance is the way that we should do. And that was missing to some extent. So the sort of normative underpinnings. But anyway, I mean, that's the first slide I want to show, that I think there's a sort of elective affinity here between Wowereit and Mayone. I'm saying this also because I want to make this argument that the normative ambiguity is important in understanding what is currently going on. So, briefly, what is it? I mean, if we talk about regulatory governance, and I preach now to the converted, I don't have to say a lot of things, and Kai mentioned it already in his introduction. When we speak of regulatory governance, we not simply refer to regulation in its broadest sense of social control. We are talking about a specific set of authoritative rules, often accompanied by some administrative agency for monitoring and enforcing compliance. Also, quite a citation from my rereadings that I did. In this model, the state does not directly deliver outcomes. Instead, it creates rules so that others, private actors, businesses, civil society, behave in ways that lead to the desired results. The regulatory state, in this sense, governs through rules and oversight, not through ownership or centralized planning. I thought one line of Jordana and Levy-Faurer nicely put it very well. The regulatory state is steering, but not rowing. That's the sort of basic idea that we talk about. And operationally speaking, this means essentially two things, I would say. And that's also put forward very openly. Regulatory governance tends to dominate when two conditions are met. First, regulation is led by experts, typically independent agency. That's one very specific feature. And the other, the state limits its direct involvement in economic and social activities. He does it more indirectly. He's steering, not rowing. Based on this operationalization, one can easily show that regulatory governance diffused. It was a success program. I mean, it essentially is something that happened in almost all liberal democracies in the last 30 years. So, I mean, here's a first slide. That's a combination of Jacint's data about regulatory agencies. I think it's 799 regulatory agencies across 70 countries in 115 countries, and it is combined with our international authority database at the ECPR, where we essentially measure the authority of international organizations for all of those states. I mean, I took out those 16 to exemplify this. The data clearly shows that we have a sharp rise in non-majoritarian institutions from the late 1970s to the early 2000s, supporting clearly the regulatory state thesis, and a corresponding decline in the relative power of majoritarian institutions, of course. I think I should emphasize briefly three final results. First, both national and international non-majoritarian institutions have increased in all 16 countries, both in all. I mean, that's quite remarkable if you look to social sciences. Secondly, the weight of international non-majoritarian institutions is higher in the EU and in Eurozone countries. National agencies dominate in the Americas, Australia, Japan, and so on. And third, the steepest growth occurred between 1980 and 2000, particularly after 1990. And you see already, in spite of the fact that the data stops at 2010, you see a first leveling out of this growth rate. So from the 2010s on, the growth rate is not anymore as steep as it was before. Let me move to the second indicator. I mean, on the one hand, more complicated, on the other hand, more easily to grasp. I mean, how do you measure the indirect role of the state? But one simple measure is, of course, if you look at state expenditures. And here again, you can see essentially that for a long time, state expenditures in the US, in Europe, in Scandinavia was growing till the 1980s. From the 1980s on, you see either a flat movement, like in the EU area and in Sweden, or even a decline for some time, as in the UK and the United States. Also here, you see that at the end of this data series, which is here 2020, you see that the trend is changing. It's going up again a little bit. So, I mean, regulatory agencies are flattening out and the state expenditures are going up again. So, I mean, you see there already that there's some counter movement going on. My argument now is that this leveling out and the partial backlash that we saw in recent years has something to do with the normative critique of the regulatory state. So, I mean, the critique that always existed, but was not explicitly taken up in the foundational texts. One is, I mean, it's known, it's nothing new, it's that it is sort of too much of depoliticization and with it a decline of democratic accountability. The response to this critique often, I mean, I'm not saying that it was not appropriate, I'm just saying it carried a sort of an elitist undertone, because essentially it said, while policies should ultimately benefit the people, they do not necessarily have to be made by the people. And I think Andrew Moravchik was most explicit by saying, well, all those policies done by regulatory agencies, people don't care about it. Therefore, it's decisive that it works, right? That was one response by the regulatory governance to the depoliticization critique. The other critique is that it was, that some people thought, well, regulatory governance, that's neoliberalism. That's essentially withdrawal of the state and all that. And here, I think the response was stronger because it was made very clear that this is a conflation. The regulatory governance approach, the regulatory state is open for re-regulation. It does not necessarily mean deregulation. In regulatory governance, so the argument goes on, can serve also the goal of equality. So these were the normative critiques and the responses. The thing now is that the response by the proponents of regulatory governance, as I said, are interesting and good, but practically speaking, they do not really help. And I think a very early statement of Robert Dahl, already one taken in 1965, one of the biggest political scientists talking about the lead discipline here, he put it in those words, and I think he got it right. The politics of compromise, adjustment, negotiation, bargaining. A politics carried out on among professional and quasi-professional leaders who constitute only a small part of the total citizen body, a politics that reflects a commitment to the virtues of pragmatism, moderation and incremental change, a politics that is unideological and even anti-ideological. Many citizens see this form of politics as too remote and bureaucratized, too addicted to bargaining and compromise, and too much an instrument of political elites and technicians. So that was Robert Dahl already in 1965. And here's the decisive point. We are not necessarily talking whether those kind of normative critiques do apply or do not apply. The question is, what is the perception of the people. And that is exactly Dahl's point, that he points out people could consider, if I use now our term, regulatory governance as something that is perceived as remote and unjust. That is essentially the points, and it clarifies the sort of problems. And it clarifies also that normative issues are not directly decisive for understanding the backlash against regulatory governance. Rather, it is the perception of people and the ways in which these perceptions are shaped and utilized by mainly authoritarian populist parties. That is the crucial thing. And two specific sets of perceptions have gained traction among a growing number of people, creating the resonance that has enabled the rise of authoritarian populism. First, the rise of non-majoritarian institutions has fostered a broadening sense of political exclusion. It is the perception of being cut off from meaningful political participation that fuels the support for authoritarian populism. That is the first normative critique. And the second is the retreat of the state from its role as a direct provider of public infrastructure has made access to basic services appear more selective and uncertain. This perceived erosion of the universal provision of some public goods has further contributed to the appeal of authoritarian governments party. So, some data on those two statements here that you see here. The first is, if you look at this panel that I showed before about the rise of non-majoritarian institutions, you can see here very easily that in parallel to the rise of non-majoritarian institutions, you have the rise of authoritarian populist parties. And you can see, this is the reason why I show it, the rise of NMIs started earlier. It started before the rise of non-majoritarian institutions. Of course, I'm aware correlation, even if there's the right temporal structure, is not causation. Yet there are at least three plausible causal mechanisms that can explain the growing and widespread sense of democratic alienation among roughly half of the populations in modern democracies. I should say, in those countries where you had where you still have a flat line regarding the authoritarian populists, like the US and Spain, you know, if you look to the current data, it has grown as well. So, I mean, it has grown essentially everywhere, and it has grown everywhere after the rise of NMIs. But what are the causal mechanisms? I mean, I just would like to put forward three. The first is Churchill's small man in the small box. As Churchill once put it, the small man in the small cabin has lost power. Citizens without tertiary education, without international experience, increasingly consider the ballot, or not increasingly, always has considered the ballot as their only means of political expression. But they also perceive now that this cabin and the cross that you make in this cabin has lost importance, because there are so many other non-majoritarian institutions that make important decisions. And this change in the structure of politics became so clearly visible during all the crises from 27 to the 2020s. I mean, especially in Europe, if you talk about those crises, we talk about people like Draghi and Drosten, those who stand for expertise, not about the governments of that time. So in that sense, what we essentially see is a sense that the decision is made not anymore in the parliament, not anymore by elected politicians. We probably don't have a lot of problems. We know Arancha and we can influence her, but those people who only have their cross in the box, they feel that they lose influence. That's one causal mechanism. Another one is that we have shown in data from our Cosmopolitan Communitarian Cleavage project that nearly all non-majoritarian institutions and most regulatory agencies and all international organizations consistently adopt positions aligned with cosmopolitan values, much more so than national parliaments do. This results in a systematic bias in institutional policy outputs that diverges from the preferences of those people who do not have tertiary education and do not live in a global world but are still the homeland people. And third, authoritarian populists exploit this disconnect. They construct a powerful narrative juxtaposing a majority that seeks to assert its will through democratic procedures against an elite that imposes its preferences through expertise and institutional installation. In this narrative, NMIs are portrayed not as neutral administrators, but as political actors who act in the name of the elite and against the interest of the people. I think Michael Gove has put this very clearly when he once said, the people have had enough of experts. So that is on the first one, and now on the second one, forget this one, we go on. Public spending and the rise of authoritarian populist parties. There's some new research going on, essentially showing that a lack in the provision and the equal provision of infrastructure is a problem in the sense that it underlies the rise of authoritarian populism. If you look at the microdata, Catherine de Vries has done some good work regarding Italy on that. And we just finished a survey in 26 countries on support or opposition to the liberal script in our excellence cluster, and I just show you the results for the macro variables controlled, and you can see the only variable that explains anything on the macro variable is essentially a thing that we call fair distribution and provision index. And what we measure there is essentially, is there sort of a equal access to basic needs provided by public infrastructure? If that is present, then you have strong support for the liberal script. If it is absent, you have strong support for authoritarian parties. And in that sense, also the second perception may be a problem. The withdrawal of the state as the direct provider of public infrastructure has made the perceived access to basic needs more selective, and this again drives the rise of authoritarian populists. I mean, it plays out, of course, very differently. If you look to rural areas, it plays out mainly in terms of less access to mobility, worse communication, no hospitals, health issues. On the city, it plays out differently. There it is living space, good education and stuff like that. But in both cases, it has something to do with the equal provision of public goods for all people, and especially the basic needs. So, I think I can come to the end and conclude. Kai gets nervous already, looking at the time. So, what does it mean? It means regulatory governance has perhaps inevitably produced its own backlash. The agenda of its opponents reads like a direct assault on the textbook pillars of the regulatory state. A, it targets expertise, international organization, and figures like Drosten and Draghi. And B, it calls for a return to the strong state, protectionism, and direct public spending. And those are the two major drivers in the sense of the rise of authoritarian populism. Now, the proponents can, of course, easily counter and say, okay, then we must refine the model, adjust regulatory governance so that it provides equal access to basic needs and that it provides additional mechanisms of participation. However, there is one problem. Such adjustments, what has been framed from the very beginning on as a possibility and called meta-regulation, this meta-regulation depend on the very thing that is under strain. Meta-regulation is essentially dependent on the working of a well-functioning liberal democracy. And if the well-functioning liberal democracy does not work anymore, then it's very hard to do good meta-regulation and to adapt regulatory governance. So in that sense, democratic backsliding comes with regression of the regulatory state. So that's my thesis, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Arancha. Thank you very much, Michael. I'm tempted to right away open up the discussion to the audience, because I think there will be many responses. Right just before we do that, let's maybe get back to Arancha. If you have one comment or response to what Michael has said, and if you have another comment, you kind of hinted something at what Arancha said about politics, maybe that would be much welcome. And then we go to the audience next.
So on my side, I very much agree with this idea that trying to depoliticize what is essentially a political choice is not a good avenue. And a point of dissent in the courses, we forgot to mention that some of the regulatory choices we made were lousy. I mean, the financial crisis 2008 was a disaster. The response was crap, as a result of which we had a huge backlash. But it wasn't because of the small man in the small box. Thank goodness we had the small man in the small box. It's because the regulation was not good. So maybe to introduce this notion also that we have to maybe be a bit critical on how we have done it, because sometimes it's produced the results that have exacerbated animosity from the public towards the regulator.
Okay, please.
Can I
Yes,
respond,
please.
or shall I? Yeah, I mean, I agree that there were many bad decisions, but the question is, are they to some extent, or is the content and the systematic content of these decisions written into the sort of the logic of those non-majoritarian institutions? I mean, some of the decisions made during the financial crisis had something to do with the sort of constitutional interests built into those non-majoritarian decisions that make those decisions. I mean, Draghi did not care about the people in Greece. He cared about the stability of the euro. And in that sense, it is, I agree with you, some of those decisions were really not very good, but to some extent it has to do with the sort of constitution of this decision making and the way they are geared. So in that sense, they hang together to some extent. The question that I have for you, Arancha, is I think you outlined very convincingly the problems, the difficulties, the special difficulties of making good decisions in our time. I'm sometimes wondering, is complexity really a change of the issues with which we are confronted, or is it essentially self-produced by the way we make political decisions and by our growing knowledge? So, I mean, I would say climate was always there as a problem. The only complexity rising or issue is essentially that we know more about it. In that sense, I'm sometimes wondering a little bit about this basic idea. Things get more difficult because issues get more difficult. But that would be just my question to you.
So my response to your point about Draghi, I would say that the reason why it landed on Draghi's lap, it shouldn't have landed on Draghi's lap, is for a failure of the finance ministers to address what was eminently a political decision about the functioning of the European monetary and financial system. And as a surrogate, it landed on Draghi, who is constitutionally, for sure, in charge of monetary stability, but he is not in charge of making fiscal decisions in Europe. So what we had is a failure of the European integration system, an unfinished integration business is a bit what we are facing today. We have a problem with an unfinished integration system in the EU, and we cannot, what we've learned, I guess what the 2008 taught us, is that we cannot do integration by stealth. That if we are to do integration, we've got to do this and tackle it head on, which is what we did differently during the COVID crisis from 2008. On your point on complexity, it's true that complex things can become even more complex and complicated and smoke the ability of the regulator. We can smoke the ability of the regulator to regulate. But I think it's one thing to regulate the safety of toys, which is a pretty defined issue, or the pesticide residues in food. It's another thing to change systems. And what we have in front of us is too many system changes at the same time. And that's a complexity because it's not just a single issue. It's a system that you have to synchronize. When you change a system. You change a piece, you change a system.
Thank you. I would like to get a sense of the eagerness of the audience to jump in at this point. So if you have a question, comment, intervention, then the usual rules apply. Some of the faces are known. We have 2 microphones here, but I would ask you to briefly introduce yourself. I see Christoph Knill there, and is there another one? I tend to look at David, who kind of is... the hand goes up almost, and a third one here to my left. So I think 2, 3 questions in a row. And again, if you could introduce yourself, that would be nice. Christoph, please.
Yeah, Christoph Knill, LMU Munich. Yeah, thank you very much for the interesting presentations. I have a question, maybe mainly for Michael. First of all, yeah, thanks for this very inspiring talk. And my question was a bit, when listening to you, where is the way out, of the problem we have with the liberal democratic state? Because in the end, when you say, the findings you mentioned, okay, we need more fair, equal distribution, we need more the return of the positive state that provides infrastructure and so on. And I think that's something we had for a long time. And then in the 1970s, they had this debate about ungovernmentability, Mancur-Olson's argument that the state is sort of you've organized interests that want their resources from the state. And there was this argument, okay, democracies have not much future, 10, 15 years to go, then everything is gone. And then to some extent, the regulatory state was the rescue of this problem in a way. And now we have the problems you mentioned. And for me, the question is a bit, where is the way out? Because if you would return to the old state, the positive state, then we would end up with the similar problems that had already been mentioned in the 1980s. So I don't know, would be interested to hear whether you have some hypothesis on this.
Thank you, Christoph. David, please. And we need a microphone for David here in the front row.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you, both speakers. It was very interesting and provoking thought. Still, I have a problem with both of you for different reasons. I learned, and you made me think about horizontal governance and how important it is, and I think I should take it into account and study it more seriously than I did in the past. So thank you for that. The thing is that the European Union and European integration is a story of success from my point of view. It's a huge story of success. And I'm speaking as an Israeli who lives to some extent in Europe. And now what I see is an opportunity to build the European Union or European governance more seriously. Why? Because of Russia. Why? Because of Trump. And this is a huge opportunity that you have to take into account and to bring into the audience And this is very important for the future of the liberal script or liberal democracy or liberal Europe or liberal world, right? Now, with Michael, it's for the first time I hear you really engage with the regulatory governance literature and regulatory state, regulatory capitalism. I hear you. I don't know if it's the first one. I also taught a course in Vienna this term on the war on the state, on the regulatory state and the state more generally. Your interpretation that the problems, or emphasis that the problems are lying within the state or regulatory state, do not go well with my understanding that the problem is with the US and the version of the regulatory governance, regulatory state that the US produced since the 1970s. And if we have a ill patient or problem is mainly with the United States, a little bit with the UK, but not with the regulatory state as was created in Europe. The war, the big threat on the regulatory state is American, right? And what do? They want, they go after regulatory state and after governance, and they do it in a way that transfer power to Trump or to the leader. So this is a war on governance as well as on regulation. And if you don't have regulation and you have unitary conception of government, you have eventually personalization of politics. So if this is the normative suggestion for Europe or anywhere else, it seems like not an alternative. Now you mentioned the positive state. I don't think this is the source of the problem. Redistribution, yes. Public infrastructure, absolutely yes. Return to the 70s, we don't need it in order to do public investment and to grow and so on. What I see, and I will finish here, is that the liberal order is, the trade order, monetary order, is under attack, and not only the regulatory state, and the liberal order is the ones that allow China and Taiwan and other not so much liberal countries to thrive. And opening the markets in Europe and the United States to those countries is really what made them grow and the threat stronger. So I would keep with the European style of the regulatory governance and regulatory state, just to make it sure, just to clarify. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. I would suggest that we go for a first round of response before we go over to you. Maybe we could do it that way, that Michael, you respond to Christoph's The Empire Strikes Back question, and then Arancha on horizontal government, and then the wholesale pushback from David back to you. So maybe first on what is the emerging model?
So I shall separate the answer.
If you don't want to, you can.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, Christoph, I think you are pointing out something which is extremely important. I skipped at a certain point the causes that were identified for the rise of the regulatory state, and as you correctly say, it is to a significant extent the crisis of the Keynesian state, and in that sense. Maybe it sounds like the implication of my talk, oh, let's go back to the Keynesian state, but obviously that would produce a lot of problems as well. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. We probably need to find new paradigms that essentially avoid both of those problems produced by the Keynesian state and those problems that has been produced by the regulatory state. And that's not an easy task, and I don't have the solution, I'm sorry. But it's probably the task that we have to tackle. I mean, still, since politics and the development of politics is also to some extent an up and down, and overreactions and too strong reactions to earlier mistakes and so on. I mean, if I look to some countries, and Germany would be some of those countries where I would say, well, I mean, some more investment into public infrastructure in the next 10 or 20 years would be quite helpful. I mean, creating, so maybe a little bit back to Keynes in that sense would be, at least for some time in this country, necessary, because we have now for 20, 25 years systematically under invested in public investments. And I think people feel that the state is not working anymore. And if the state is not working anymore, that is essentially a potential that can be used by those who want to get rid of the state. In that sense, I mean, maybe going back for 10 years to some soft form of Keynesianism, and then finding a solution within those 10 years where we have to go next, that would be then the strategy that I would suggest. And I come back to you.
Back to Keynes, or just to better trains would be my follow-up questions on that. On horizontal governance, and now David wants to engage with that topic. Maybe I can top up that question or remark with another remark. It's not that it has not been tried before. It's technical infrastructure. Yeah, we move in 2 years. It's a private school. Yeah, we need public investment. So it has been tried before, but it's damn hard to get horizontal coordination, because the system flips back to its normal basic instincts, which is turf protection and vertical coordination.
So, look, when I was foreign minister, there was such thing called climate diplomacy. My climate colleagues said, that's my turf, because it's climate. And I would say, well, that's my turf, because it's diplomacy. Then came tech diplomacy. My innovation minister said, that's mine, it's technology. And I would say, well, that's mine, it's diplomacy. So it's a very funny way to illustrate that horizontalizing administrations, horizontalizing governance is very complicated, because it's about power distribution and sharing power. And sharing power is not an easy thing. But I want to go back to these two questions that in a way talk of two different fault lines that we have to deal with. The fault line in the US is not the same as the fault line in Europe. It may look the same, it's not the same. So let's not get overhyped by what is happening in the US. In the US, it's an attack on checks and balances. And there is no desire to have checks and balances because there is a project. There was never a big, they were never big fans of regulatory drives, huh? Let's face it. But now there is a conscious drive to remove checks and balances. Now in Europe, the situation is slightly different. There is also a fight. It's the fight between integrationists and sovereignists. Now, part of these sovereignists love the state. Others are libertarians, don't want a state. But they have in common that they want to repatriate competencies to the national level. So the fight is slightly different. And now, to move forward, I very much agree with you, David, and I've spent 30 years of my life doing that, and I hope to continue doing that. But this fight is between those who want to make sure that Europe is swimming against the current. The world is swimming in a direction of nationalism. And Europe, to survive, has to swim in the direction of sharing sovereignty, to be more sovereign. And this is a big issue. And it's difficult, because you're swimming against the current. But that's the fight. And regulation reflects this, too.
Thank you. So I saw at least 3 hands to my left.
I need to respond to him. That was your...
That's right. I'm sorry.
That was your
sorry.
strategy, right?
Keep it short, Michael.
Yeah, I keep it short. I keep it short.
Right.
I just want to point out, also in following up on your remarks, I mean, I don't see the situation the difference in the situation between the US and Europe not that strongly as you obviously do. I mean, I agree with you. Trump creates historical opportunities for Europe, but I mean, whether Europe will take this historical opportunity, that's a sort of a very difficult question. And part that it is not very likely that it takes these historical opportunities is the strength of authoritarian populist party, especially the same sort of party that essentially runs now the US. And I mean, in Poland and in Hungary, we also have struggles against checks and balances. Even in those countries in Europe where we don't have those guys in power, there you see essentially coalitions that have been built together to prevent authoritarian populists, which are not really coalitions in the sense that they have a common project or something like this. And that also is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to take those historical opportunities. I mean, I really hope, and I'm really on the side of those who would say, this is a historical opportunity, let's take it. But there are so many forces against it, and those forces who are against it are very much driven or are driven by authoritarian populists. And in that sense, the situation is not that much different in Europe than from the US. I mean, just think about Poland, this situation. They vote out the old government. They have a guy who does reasonable stuff, and now they just vote for a president which essentially prevents the possibility to re-establish checks and balances in Poland. In that sense, I mean, I'm happy that Trump is not the president of the EU or not the chancellor in Germany. So in that sense, there is a significant difference, but we shouldn't overdraw the difference.
Thank you. May I ask to keep your interventions short, please? So, please, you're next, and you wait for the micro. Eva is next, and then we go to you, and let's see how how short. And we overrun a little bit, but not too much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Scott Jacobs. I started the OECD program on regulation in 1991, and I wanted to thank you for mentioning Gian Domenico Maioni. And we had some very crucial discussions with Professor Maioni in Paris and Brussels back in the early days, and he was very influential in how we designed that program, and he should get credit for that. Thank you. Now, I do want to come back. I want to agree strongly with David. First of all, I think as an American, the EU experiment seems to be strongly a success. In fact, the Europeans seem far more negative on Europe than the rest of the world. I mean, the world, despite Trump's comments, the world seems clearly a better place because of the European experiment. And so just keep moving. I mean, we depend on you. I want to come, I was really struck by the fact that both of you were negative on the role of expertise in the non-majoritarian institutions. And I guess I understand that partly, but actually, I don't understand the counterfactual, or what would have, the regulatory state has been enormously successful in improving the quality of life around the world. I mean, it's hard to imagine any counterfactual to that. And I mean, I was thinking as you were speaking, if the man in the box doesn't like expertise, he's going to really love AI algorithms that write regulations and laws. We're not going to slow down the course of change. And I got the feeling from both of you that you felt the regulatory state was actually leading governance, but actually the regulatory state is very reactive to change. It's lagging behind. It's reacting to change that's occurring all over, regardless of the regulatory state. So what is the next step? And you mentioned it going back to Keynesianism or maybe mercantilism at some point, I don't know. But I was very interested in what you said about pedagogy, which means to me communication and education of the population about the challenges that the regulatory state is trying to address. Can you tell us more about what you mean by pedagogy?
Thank you. Eva, microphone.
Hi, thank you, Eva Heidbreder, University of Magdeburg. And I'm triggered first by the fact that we need a female voice also from the audience, and secondly by your really inspiring talks and that were intellectual fun. I very much agree to your analysis of the zero-sum mentality. And when I teach EU, I never say, don't forget about transfer sovereignty. It's not about that, it's about cooperation. That is the EU. That's our problem with Brexit, right? And all that. And we saw in the UK how the zero-sum mentality got in. And the regular state, I would agree, is part of that, starting with Blair and putting numbers instead of reasons and et cetera. So it's part of that. But, and I would say that, of course, we have an advantage in cooperation. That's the EU. Now, the EU, I see, is in a major challenge because we have to keep that up internally and strengthen it internally, while we need to be more defensive to the outside. I'm from Germany, so speaking about trade, we don't know how to do it, right? We don't know how to do it with closed markets. We don't have a model. We don't know how to sell cars if China doesn't buy them. We really don't know. So how do we keep that up? And here I would also fully agree, and I think I expected that politics would come up in your talk, Michael, but so they came. But I would also agree we are in a bigger systems change, and in a systems change moment, we have the opportunity of collapse, and then we have new systems arise. We don't want that. How can we do politics? How can we do politics? How can we do politics if our cleavages have shifted, if our political model is built for an industrial age, but not for the new forms of communication, not for interest representation? The European Parliament is interesting in that respect, because I think it is an laboratory. How can we do politics that at least reaches people and can aggregate new formations of interest in a very pluralistic and very and also very loose of institutional binding forces like churches or whatever?
Thank you, Eva. So how can we do politics? That was my question. I noted as well to you. And what is the counterfactual again is to you? Please, Arancha first.
So on politics, let me give you an example of an area where we are going to see a big comeback of the state and where we will face backlash of the citizen, which is defense and security. So how not to do it? Focus on fixing a percentage of GDP that we're going to spend in the next 10 years to please somebody. How to do it? Start debating the risks. How do you build a common defense and security in Europe if you don't share the same nightmares? If the nightmares of the Lithuanian have nothing to do with the nightmares of the Portuguese or the nightmares of the Brits, because on defense and security, we're going to do it with the Brits and with the Turks. So we start the house from the roof. We are debating whether it's 2%, 3%, or 5%, instead of starting, as we should, from the risks, from an environment that used to be more benign and is no longer benign, with threats that are clearly outside and inside, with a discussion of the capacities that we have and the capacities that we lack, with putting a price tag to the capacities that we lack, and with then defining how we are going to finance them. And part of the financing will have to be in common, because you don't build a common defense by people investing on their own stuff in their own corner. So this is an example of how we should be doing politics. Some countries are doing it. Some are not. And those who are doing it are finding the citizens are receptive. And those that are not doing it will face a backlash in the polls.
Thank you. On the counterfactual, just allow me a remark on Majone. I always wondered how he developed from the person who wrote with Wildawski on adaptive implementation and a book about discourse in policymaking for policymakers towards this type of politician, this type of promoting non-majoritarian institutions. So Michael, the regulatory state has worked, so why is it not appreciated more?
Well, I mean, I thought I appreciated it, that it was a historical success, right, and that it was dominating politics for a very long time. So it needs to be appreciated. And I mean, just to be very, very clear now, and when we talk now about the normative side, when I make the argument that the rise of non-majoritarian institutions and a growing sense on the side of the people that it is not anymore the elected representatives who make the decisions, but it is experts, and it is the EU, and it is international institutions and all that. When I'm saying this is a problem, then I'm not saying I'm against expertise. I mean, that would be just something very stupid to say. But at the same time, believing that it's important to have expertise, believing that it is important to have international institutions, believing that it is important to have the EU is something that requires to understand how those forces produce a sort of backlash against those institutions. And if we don't do it, then it's over. Then we don't have them anymore. And therefore it's so important to understand those negative dynamics. As I said, I don't have the easy solution for that. I mean, sometimes the only thing that you can say is that you identify a problem in a dilemma or something like this. And it is a dilemma. I'm studying global governance. And of course, how could I argue that we don't need an international climate regime or an international organization taking care of climate or something like that? Of course, I think we need it. But then on the other hand, we need to have someone that has legitimacy on the side of people for whom they formulate their regulations. So my response, and now we are talking counterfactual, I'm now really going to be the drawing the big vision for the future. My response clearly is not to the kind of problems that I identify to say renationalization and getting rid of expertise. That's not. What I would say is what we need is a form of democratization of those bodies who have expertise. And there I'm not necessarily talking about majority decisions or stuff like that. I'm talking how can we bring in people to be part of that. I mean, we are talking about deliberative fora. We are talking about a situation in a world. I mean, have you ever heard that, or to put it differently, since I'm living in Berlin, I know how often the parliament is listening to experts before they make decisions. They usually have 6 rounds or something like this. Have you ever heard that a central bank has essentially consulted the people who are affected by their decision? I mean, here there is a lot of possibility of creating new mechanisms of, in a sense, it's now in quotation mark, democratizing those non-majoritarian institutions. That would be essentially the way I would suggest to go. I argue if we stick to the model that we have, then we won't have the model anymore for a very long time. Look to the US.
Thank you. 2 30-second questions, please. These are the final ones. Here, and another microphone here, please.
Thanks a lot for your presentations, in particular on, again, Michael Zürn, on your dualism between regulation on the one hand and public investment or public infrastructure on the other. I mean, there are so many different policy fields also. I mean, and varieties of public infrastructure investment. I mean, the US has always invested into industrial policy more than Europe has done, although less into redistribution and welfare policies. So if we then make the correct conclusion about your arguments, would it not be best then to somehow combine the gap of politicization? I mean, politicizing public infrastructure, would this then not be a good solution for finding new recipes for the future? Not just on, focusing on regulation, but on, okay, how could public investment be organized in a more participation-oriented way, simply?
Thank you. Thank you.
Hermann Lückenklausener from the University of Göttingen. My question is very much related to the regulatory failure question we already discussed, and it's about the specific case of large renationalization of private facilities and utilities in Great Britain, and how the failure of privatizing there the water and the railway, how this affects actually the regulatory governance so far, because we have still the regulatory agencies, but we have also a new mixture of state control over relevant public infrastructure. And I just wonder, like, could this be the new model, or is it like a certain model in progress? And yeah.
Thank you for the two questions. Fairly specific, but I would also invite you for a closing statement, if you wish, Arancha, if you could go first, please.
No, that's not
Okay.
Okay. Oh, no, here's
There's another one.
I have my own. Yeah.
Yeah, you have.
I mean, just two then very specific responses. One is, I wanted to emphasize with our finding from the Liberal Script Survey, essentially, that dissatisfaction and support for authoritarian populist parties is not necessarily driven by inequality, by the unequal distribution of private income. If it would be the case, it would be so stupid to vote for Trump. It is the dissatisfaction with some things are not working anymore, and that was this finding that the public infrastructure may be quite important, and that leads me very specifically only to the second comment. Privatization is one of the pathways via which the production of public goods gets more problematic, or is even or is less equally open or equally accessible to all people. But it can be also, if there is no privatization, it can be also the case. I mean, look at schools in major cities in Germany. There, essentially, you have a systematic underinvestment. The result is that the schools are still there, of course, but then at the same time, private schools pop up, and the people who have money send their kids to private schools, and in that sense, also this mechanism can produce an unequal access to public goods like education. So I'm just saying it can go both ways. I mean, it's not contradicting you at all. I'm just pointing out there are two pathways.
Thank you, Michael, also for bringing in, without naming him, Hirschman, who grew up quite close to this place. Thank you. Arancha, final comment, word, reflection from your end?
From where I see this, we're going to see in the future a greater amount of public investments. If it's only in Europe, the huge amount of investments we will see in security and defense, and we will see a greater regulatory drive, if only because of the impact that technology is going to have on white collar. This is coming. So the question for us is not about less, it's about how to do it in a better way. So whether we chose the path of privatizing is about doing it better than what we've done it up until now. Whether it is about regulating with independent agencies is doing it in a more democratic manner. Whatever we choose as the solution, we are going to need to do it better, but we are not going to need to do less of, given the world we are moving into.
Thank you. And please, a round of applause for the two keynote speakers.